Hello class, this is Justin Roberts, and I'm here to talk to you about Le Morte Darthur by Sir Thomas Malory. Now, let's start off with Malory himself. Very little is known about Sir Thomas Malory, but it is certain that a Sir Thomas Malory authored Le Morte d'Arthur. The most common belief was that Malory lived in Warwickshire and was a man who fought on both sides of the War of Roses, served in Parliament, and died in 1471. However, some historians believe that the Sir Thomas Malory that wrote Le Morte d'Arthur was a Welshman that lived at the same time as the Malory previously mentioned. Malory, for sure, was a knight, wrote Le Morte d'Arthur while imprisoned for 9 years during the reign of King Edward IV. Now, the story itself was first published in 1485 by William Caxton. The book was originally titled The Book of King Arthur and His Noble Knights of the Round Table and was actually 6 separate romances, but Caxton gave it the misleading title of Le Morte d'Arthur and compressed it into one extremely long story in his publication. The language used in the story is caught somewhere between Middle English and the English that was commonly used during the time of William Shakespeare and Wyatt. It is known as the last medieval English work about King Arthur, and it was influenced heavily by some French prose romances of the time. Now, before I continue on, I just want to make it clear that King Arthur actually did not exist in real life. He was not a real person, which I found kind of shocking how many people believe that through my research, but I just want to make that clear before we get into any farther of Le Morte d'Arthur. King Arthur did not actually exist in real life. That being said, let's talk about the first aspect of the story, the conspiracy against Lancelot and Guinevere. So Lancelot and Guinevere were cheating on King Arthur behind King Arthur's back, and 2 knights, Sir Agravain and Sir Mordred, knew about it and were unhappy with Lancelot and Guinevere and the damage they caused to the chivalric code of knighthood, and threatened to Sir Gawain that they planned to tell King Arthur about Lancelot and Guinevere's adultery. Gawain, being one of Arthur's main knights, opposed this, but the knights assured him that King Arthur would never go to war with Lancelot because Lancelot was Arthur's most trusted knight at the time, and because of everything Lancelot's done for Arthur, Arthur would dare not do that. So, with that being said, Agravain went and told Arthur of this, and Arthur initially did not believe Agravain, but at the same time, he allowed him and Mordred to take 12 knights to go fight Lancelot. But with that being said, Arthur gave him the warning that Lancelot was the greatest of all the knights and should carry on with caution. The knights staked out Guinevere's room later that night, waiting to attack Lancelot when he arrived. However, King Arthur's warning ended up being a foreshadowing, as Lancelot, declaring his love for Guinevere, killed all the knights except for Sir Mordred, who fled before Lancelot had the chance. The next part was the war that breaks out between Arthur and Lancelot. Arthur learns about the deaths of the knights and grieves about all of them. Sir Gawain, like I said, one of his most trusted knights, wanted to plot revenge due to the fact that some of his knights were his brothers, but instead Arthur convinced him to join forces with him and plot an attack against Lancelot and his castle, Joyous Gard. Arthur showed up to Joyous Gard with many knights, dukes, and earls from all across the country and demanded that Lancelot meet him on the battlefield. Lancelot refused, locking himself in the castle for 15 weeks. Finally, Lancelot broke his lock and spoke to Arthur and Gawain over the side of the wall of his castle, exclaiming that he killed all those knights that night. He went through 12 of King Arthur's knights, and he killed them all in self-defense, and how he wanted to call a truce. However, Arthur and Gawain declared the truce, and they decided to go to war. Now, jump ahead of time a little bit. We talk about the death of King Arthur. It began with a treaty meeting between Arthur and his now knight-turned-traitor, Sir Mordred. At this point, a lot of Arthur's knights have betrayed him, and he has very few left in his corner. As the meeting turned south, Arthur attacked Mordred and killed him, but Mordred got a blow to Arthur's head that ended up being a mortal wound. Arthur then commanded his newest right-hand knight, Sir Bedivere, to take his sword Excalibur and throw it into the water. However, Sir Bedivere did not want to waste the nice sword, did not toss it in the water, but Arthur called him out on his lie and told him to do it. As Bedivere tossed Excalibur into the water, a hand rose from the water, grabbing the sword and pulling it in. After that happened, Arthur told Bedivere to bring him to the water, put him on a barge, and set him off into the ocean, where the Lady of the Lake took him. As he was leaving, Arthur assured Bedivere that everything would be all right without him. And then finally, we talk about the deaths of Lancelot and Guinevere. Lancelot and 7 of his men traveled to the nunnery where Guinevere lived out her life, only to find out she passed away a mere hour before he got there. Guinevere also requested to be buried next to Arthur. Lancelot fell extremely ill 6 weeks after Guinevere's death, as he was eating very little and crying and praying at the tomb of Arthur and Guinevere. Lancelot would then eventually pass and would be brought back to Joyous Gard to be buried. Now, two major things that were in these stories were the lack of chivalry and dealing with change. Now, back in the time of Sir Thomas Malory, chivalry and the chivalric code were a big deal to those in England. So the idea that so many of Arthur's knights would break the chivalric code must have been a huge shock to the audience. But as the story goes on, it seems as though the moral was that those that break the code end up suffering the consequences, as Sir Mordred did with his life, and as Sir Lancelot saw with Guinevere not only abandoning him to become a nun, but to eventually request to be buried next to King Arthur and not next to Sir Lancelot. Another one was dealing with change. Throughout the course of the story, Arthur had to deal with the changing of his knights, from knights that would just flat out leave him, to knights that would betray him, to knights that would join. Another aspect of this was when Sir Bedivere was worried about what the kingdom would become without Arthur, but Arthur assured him that everything would be all right, which kind of shows that the moral of that would be that that change, no matter how bad it seems, can always be found as good. Now, time for the discussion. So tell me what you thought about my presentation. Tell me what you think about Le Morte Darthur, Sir Thomas Malory, or anything else having to do with King Arthur. Thank you.